Hello my lovely nerds, and good to have you back in this slightly greener than usual video. This week we're getting lost in how to create a magical forest of our very own. So let's get on with it. Magical forests are a long utilised staple biome of fantasy worlds. Although they are a source of huge potential variation, and yet all too often, and I've been culpable of doing this myself, we tend to create forests that have a very similar feel to them. Most of the time in Western fantasy stories, we get something like the Forest of the Ents from Lord of the Rings, with bubbling streams and tall creaking trees and distant twittering bird call. But how do we avoid this? Well, the first question to ask yourself is, what is the geography of this region that your magical forest will be found in? There is a huge variety in what counts as a forest around the world. They cover about a third of our landmass, and we have three broad types of forest: temperate, tropical, and boreal. Temperate forests have temperatures that vary hugely because of seasons throughout the year. They also tend to have a lot of rainfall, have quite fertile soils, and a huge variation in the species that live there. Next are the tropical forests, which have higher temperatures, less temperature fluctuation over the course of the year, and they also produce a huge biodiversity in terms of the species that are found living there. Then you have the boreal forests, which are the colder ones, with temperatures usually a lot below freezing. So this means evergreen trees and animals that are quite hardy, either because they're hibernating or they migrate away for the harsher months of the year. Obviously, your worlds can be very different. Perhaps you have a world that has different biomes from those that we have on our planet. Perhaps it never rains but only ever hails, and so the trees in your forest have to become a lot hardier in order to survive this. There are a lot of climate factors you can take into account when designing your forest, but it's not just the climate that you need to consider here. There are many factors about a forest that will influence the setting of a story, such as the size of the forest. Do you have much larger forests that are spanning countries, or have the civilizations in your worlds embarked on a process of systematic deforestation? So there really aren't that many forests left. What does this mean for the trade routes through or around the forest? And what about the resources of the local environment? All of that and more should be considered, but that's the boring stuff. Let's get to the magic part of the video. Now, there are several ways that you can make your forest magical. First off, enchantments. This is magic that has been externally applied to the forest. Now, there isn't a whole lot of science that I can really incorporate into this part of the video, so I don't have much insight to give into the enchantment side of it, since this is a literal "a wizard did it" territory. So I'm going to instead wade into what the consequences of this enchantment could be for your forest, because in my humble opinion, the best enchantments have a poetic feel to them. They amplify some aspect that the forest already had. For example, we all know how tricky forests can be to navigate. I myself got lost in one just a few weeks ago. So forests that are spelled to be unnavigable, have an easily believable feel to them. And there are lots of other features about forests that you could use for inspiration here. Do you have a maleficent spelled forest that's overgrown and very thorny and difficult to pass through? Whatever you pick, enchanted forests can be very varied since they aren't bound by the laws of science. But enchanted forests aren't the only type of magical forest that we can create. My favourite way of doing this is exploring the effect of fantasy species upon the forest. The Ents being a fantastic example of this. They are the shepherds of the forest in Lord of the Rings. Their lives revolve around ensuring that the forest grows well, but their age gives the forest itself a very old and musty and dangerous feel to it. And there are many stories of people getting lost in the forest, probably killed by the Ents because they tried to fell some trees they weren't supposed to. So if you're going to create a fantasy forest, consider the creatures inhabiting it and the effect that they might have on the forest as a way of creating an atmospheric feel to what you've created. I did something similar in a story I wrote, and it was a fantastic way of creating a unique atmosphere. I had a species who could access and edit the memories of plants. Okay, plants don't exactly have memories like we do, but they do have the ability to learn, which is entirely based on some level, their ability to retain information and process the sensory information about the world around them. It all comes down to the senses. Their lives revolve around the presence of sunlight, water, key nutrients, so their growth is orientated towards getting more of those things. And they can do this because they have sensors that can detect things like sunlight, heat and moisture. And their awareness of these things is what I allowed my race of memory manipulators to interfere with. They themselves were sensitive to sunlight, so they live underneath the forest, but they trick the leaves of the trees above to thicken the canopy, killing off a lot of the plant life on the forest floor and making the forest exceptionally dark and safer for them. They also trick the fruit-bearing trees and bushes to grow downwards under the ground, using a tremendous amount of energy and resources just to do that, but so that the people living underground had access to the fruits and so they didn't have to go up above ground ever. The story itself actually started after this race of people had been driven from their underground home. So the forest that they lived in became unsustainable because they weren't there to cultivate it anymore. So that meant a lot of the trees above started to die back, strewing the forest floor with all these dead trees. And the tunnels that the people lived in often gave way, so that the people walking on the forest floor above would regularly fall to their death in what was known as a grave. For all these reasons and more, the forest was called the Deadwood, and it has a very different feel to it than other forests in the neighbouring countries. It also helped create an awful lot of conflict in the story and an atmosphere that really helped me when I was writing the story. So Fanghorn and the Deadwood are 2 examples of fantasy forests, but there are plenty more out there. And it doesn't have to just be a fantasy race you've created that can affect the forest. Any species of flora or fauna can have an ability that can change the forest you create. Do you have trees that are drawn towards the source of magic nearby? Because magic is energy and they like that, they get something from it. So each year the forest is creeping closer and closer to a neighbouring city, and all the citizens there, maybe they have annual games that are about felling the trees back in a competitive sport. My best advice, as always, is to look at what is possible and use that to inspire you. In mine, that was the manipulation of plant sensors, but there are plenty of other methods out there that you can explore. From hallucinogenic fruits to arid forest floors where the trees have evolved to capture rain in their great bowl-like leaves above. Alright then, that's your lot for this week. I hope you enjoyed learning about all the fantastic types of magical forests that we can create in our worlds. I find the topic fascinating and I would love to see them featured more in fantasy. So if you have a fantasy forest in your world, then please let me know in the chat below. Use 3 words to describe the atmosphere that your forest creates. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a fantastic week, my nerds. Goodbye!